Good morning, everyone. My name is Leanne Larange, and I'm speaking to you today from Edmonton. I would like to begin today's presentation by acknowledging that Physiotherapy Alberta's offices are located on Treaty 6 territory, as well as the Métis Nation of Alberta's Region 4, which has been and continues to be the home of many Indigenous peoples since time immemorial. Physiotherapy Alberta recognizes that Indigenous peoples have been helping many to live healthy lives on this land since long before settlers arrived. With that, we commit ourselves to helping move people forward in their journey towards a good life, and doing so in a way that honors the spirit and intent of treaty, that of peace, friendship, and understanding. We also recognize that people from across Alberta and beyond are joining us today, and encourage you to take a few moments to learn more about the lands, peoples, and treaties with which you may be in relationship. And it's a real pleasure to have you all here this morning for episode number 1 of a series of webinar presentations on the topic of evidence-based practice. This format is a bit different from our usual webinar presentation format. This year we're trying something new. So we'll be doing 3 presentations on the subject of evidence-based practice, and we'll be talking about different subtopics within that and breaking those out into somewhat manageable chunks of information. So this morning's session, we actually have 3 chapters of content that we'll be covering. Chapter 1, presented by Teri Slade, will be on the topic of how do you know what you know and different theories of evidence. Chapter 2, presented by Doug Gross, will talk about open access and predatory publication and some of the risks and benefits of open access publication and that trend in scientific publication world. And Chapter 3 will be presented by 3 early career and student physiotherapists. So we have Alex Sue, Andrea Young, and Alex Bell-Moratto speaking to us on the subject of spotting low quality or questionable evidence online. So marketing, media, social media, memes, etc. And they'll be sharing their experiences as evidence users and people who access evidence via the internet. We look forward to that presentation from all of the presentations. Before we begin, I just want to make sure everyone is familiar with this platform and where they can find everything. So in the center of your screen, you'll be seeing our slide deck. To the left of the slide deck is the presenter biography section where you can read more about each of our speakers. To the right of our slide deck is the question and answer pod, and you can type in your questions to the speakers at any time during the session. Teri Slade and Doug Gross will be able to join us today to do our question and answer portion of the presentation at the end of the session, so that you can type in your questions at any time. And finally, at the bottom of the page, you'll see a series of widgets, and one of them looks like a piece of paper with some writing on it. That's where you'll find the handout for this morning's presentation. And with that, it's my great pleasure to turn over the presentation to Teri Slade to speak to us about theories of knowledge and how we know what we know. So over to you, Teri.
Thanks so much, Leanne. So today we're going to get our webinar series started off with how do you know what you know? So I would like to ask you a question to start us off. How do you know what to do as a clinician? If you have a patient in front of you and this patient is communicating to you their symptoms, their experience, how do you know what to do? So I'd like to give you an example from history to get you thinking a little bit about how you know what you know as a clinician. So let's go back a few hundred years to when passenger trains were a new technology. At that point in time, there came to be a new type of injury that healthcare providers had never seen before. So you had these cases in which people would be in a passenger train, and the train will be moving at high speeds, higher speeds than any passenger vehicle had moved up until that point, and there could be an accident. So there would be these cases of accidents where the train would stop moving abruptly or would hit something, and the people who are inside that passenger train would be thrown about inside their train cars. And this created a type of patient complaint that healthcare providers hadn't seen up until that point. they called it railway spine. So these people, they would complain of headaches, back pain, neck pain, all the sorts of things that, you know, today are not surprising, but at the time hadn't really been heard of before. And at the time, all the knowledge that surrounded what pain is and how healthcare providers knew anything about pain, their knowledge, their concept of what pain is, could be summed up very boiled down to an equation. Pain equals tissue damage. So their understanding was that pain was only real if there was tissue damage associated with it. And with these cases of people who had railway spine, they couldn't find very much tissue damage. In some cases, they couldn't find any tissue damage at all. And so their understanding is that pain was only real if it was accompanied by tissue damage. And so the way that healthcare providers talked about these patients reporting railway spine was often very horrendous. They would talk about how these patients were complaining, how they just wanted to sue the railway companies to make money. Women were often described as hysterical following these accidents. And they dismissed these claims. So the patients were saying, I am in pain, and the healthcare providers were saying, you can't be in pain. That is not real. That is not true. I cannot know that you have pain because there is no tissue damage. Now today, we think that's kind of ridiculous because we don't know it as railway spine. We know it as whiplash. And whiplash cases are quite common. People drive around in cars very frequently, and people get in accidents quite frequently. And those accidents result in whiplash, and you've probably treated cases of whiplash. But I would like you to put yourself back in a period of time where the concept of whiplash didn't exist. Now, physiotherapy wasn't really a thing at this point in history, but you can put yourself in those shoes. If everything you had ever been taught said that where there is pain, there is tissue damage, and the patient did not have any evidence of tissue damage, what would you have thought? Would you have thought their pain was real? Would you have said that they were malingering or hysterical based on their complaints? When it comes to ways of knowing, as we talk about them often in terms of research, we use kind of three major areas of how we know what we know. The first one is ontology, and so that, very broadly speaking, is the study of reality. What is real? Can we understand something as being real? Epistemology refers to the study of knowing. How can we know? How can we know that something is real? How can we know if something is not real? And finally, axiology, the study of value. What do we value from a research perspective? What do we value from a clinical decision-making perspective? And so when we're talking about ways of knowing, there are these kind of three very broad areas of reality, knowing that reality, and of our value. So in this presentation, I'm going to cover 4 major ways of knowing as they are used in Western research today. The conversation on ways of knowing is way broader than these 4 categories, and if we had all day, we would talk more about them. But I'm just going to talk about these 4 ways of knowing, and I would encourage you as well to engage your curiosity a little bit in understanding how Indigenous ways of knowing can influence our clinical practice and what evidence-based practice looks like in physiotherapy. And I'm referring you to those resources listed at the bottom. I'm a settler. I am not Indigenous, and so I don't speak for any particular Indigenous community, of course, but I refer you to Jairus Swindrovich, who has done a lot of work on evidence-based practice through an Indigenous lens. These resources are listed as being for pharmacists, but there are definitely a lot of valuable implications for physiotherapists as well. So 4 major ways of knowing in Western research today. We'll start with positivism. So positivism is a way of knowing in Western research today wherein we consider reality to be singular and we consider it to be perfectly knowable. So if we think about pain through a positivist lens, this would be assuming that pain either exists or it doesn't, and if we have the right tools to measure it, we can know if that pain exists and how intense it is. So from a positivist lens, we might say that the pain is either real or it's not, and if I ask the right questions or if I use the right questionnaire tool, then I can understand whether that pain exists or it doesn't. In post-positivism, we consider reality to be singular, and we consider it to be not perfectly knowable. So in a post-positivist lens, we would say that pain either exists or it doesn't. This patient either has pain or they don't. But no matter how good my tools are, no matter what questionnaire I use, no matter what questions I ask, I will never be able to perfectly know that pain that that person experiences or doesn't. From a constructivist lens, so in constructivism, we consider reality to be multiple. And so in this case, it would be that each person has their experience of reality. Each person has their reality. And in the case of pain, we would consider that only the person experiencing that pain has that reality of pain. And as a clinician, you can work with or use tools to try to understand that person's reality, try to construct a concept of their reality, and you can try to understand it. But that reality is theirs, and it is not perfectly knowable by anyone external. We each have our own sense of what reality is and our own knowledge of that reality. Critical theory is a lens for a lens in research in which we put at the forefront structures of power. So in a critical theory lens in research and clinical practice, we might say, well, how do structures of power affect this participant or affect this patient that I have? How do they affect this person's experience of pain, and how do they affect their ability to express that pain to me as a clinician? So with critical theory, we might say, well, there is some evidence to suggest that women's pain is not as respected generally as men's pain. There's been some research showing that women are more likely to be prescribed sedatives and men are more likely to be prescribed painkillers. And so we look at that structure of power in critical theory and we will place that at the forefront of the research and decision making. We might also look at something like attitudes towards Black individuals, and historically speaking, we can see that there's lots of evidence in history of Black people of white people considering that Black people have a higher pain tolerance. And so that has led to a tendency today in clinical practice for the pain of Black individuals to be discredited because of this history of discrediting Black people's pain complaints. So with critical theory, we would say, okay, that structure of power is important for clinical decision making, and that's important for conducting our research. Positivism and post-positivism are most commonly associated with quantitative research. And constructivism and critical theory are most commonly associated with qualitative research, but those are not exclusive relationships. You can have qualitative research that is positivist or post-positivist, and you can have quantitative research that is constructivist or critical. So although we have these associations with ways of knowing and research methods, those aren't exclusive relationships. So considering all of the things that we've talked about in terms of ways of knowing, ways to know what you know, historically ways that people have known what they know, I would like to ask you, what is evidence? And throughout this webinar series, we'll be talking about evidence, how we use it in clinical practice, and I'd like you through all of that to consider how you know what evidence is useful for informing clinical practice. I'd like to thank you for your time. I will be around for questions at the end of the webinar today, and you are welcome to contact me at the email address here if you have questions either after the live session is over or if you would just like to contact me privately. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks very much, Teri, for that strong start to this series and for challenging us to consider our ways of knowing. Next up, we have Doug Gross speaking to us about open access and predatory publication. Over to you, Doug.
Thank you, Leanne, for the introduction and invitation to help put together this webinar series. And thanks, Teri, for that great introduction to ways of knowing, giving a foundation to the main research paradigms. My topic is scientific publishing, and specifically the benefits and challenges of open access publishing in predatory journals. We're all familiar with the basic model of evidence-based practice, indicating that our clinical decisions should be based on the combination of clinical experience, our clients' values and preferences, and high-quality research evidence. This model works great when these align. What to do when they do not will be a topic of a future webinar, but today our topic is how to locate the highest quality research evidence. The 5 steps of evidence-based practice indicate that we start by asking clinical questions. We then search for evidence, critically appraise what we find, then implement and evaluate. This process was already challenging when the only sources of clinical information were textbooks and printed journal articles, but since the 1990s, we've experienced an explosion of internet-based information, websites, wikis, blogs, and other social media platforms. We are now flooded with information, and it has become increasingly difficult to distinguish trustworthy from untrustworthy information or facts from fake news. It's hard to determine what should even be considered evidence. Through all this innovation, one thing that has remained constant in science is the importance placed on publishing in peer-reviewed journals. This is the main goal of researchers and the traditional method of sharing scientific results. We trust that peer review will increase quality of the final product and filter out papers that shouldn't be published. With the current publishing model, journal editors and reviewers provide low-cost or free service, while the publishers ensure product quality and tradition while making a profit. And what a profit they have made. The scientific publishing industry has been described as staggeringly profitable, with margins rivaling the tech giants like Google, Apple, and Amazon. The combination of this massive potential for profit combined with technological innovations has led to several changes in scientific publishing. I'm going to discuss 3 of these advances, which have had both positive and negative consequences. The first is open access publication, where research papers are made freely available online. Open access is fantastic and allows all of us to get behind the paywall to access papers that are now widely available to anyone with a computer and internet access. It's great for researchers as it helps them to share research results. In fact, many funders like CAHR now make open access publication mandatory for the research they fund. It's also great for the publishers since they profit from the article processing charge regardless of how many people read the paper. If you see this symbol online, It means that the work is available, open access. The symbol may be green or gold, indicating different routes researchers can take to make their work open access. Green open access is self-archiving by researchers. This can include publishing on a personal website or within a public repository, like the University of Alberta's Education and Research Archive, ERA. Gold open access, on the other hand, includes fully open access journals where researchers pay article processing charges after their work has been peer-reviewed and accepted, or hybrid journals that offer both open access and traditional pay-to-access options. Because the open access model is so profitable, we have seen many new open access journals. But a downside has been varying standards of peer review and potential for a reduction in quality. Here's a paper that Chad Cook and colleagues published in the first edition of a new open access journal to demonstrate that just about anything can get published if you have the cash to pay for it. The title is The Temporal Effect of Repeated Spinal Manipulation and Mortality Ratio, a case report. You can see within the methods that the authors added things that just didn't make sense, like how they followed the Transportation Safety Agency guidelines for traveling with fluids. In the description of their case, they report that the individual had all vital signs absent. At initial assessment, his family members reported that he had exhibited markedly decreased activity, little interest in socialization, and tended to lay around all day. We like to think that a more thorough peer review would have caught this type of thing before publication, but this is a risk with low-quality peer review in some of these open access journals. A second advance in scientific publishing has been making preprints available online before peer review, at times with full transparency in the peer review and editorial process. Again, this has had some positive and some negative consequences. The obvious positive is that it allows researchers to share their results immediately, and then anyone can read and provide feedback. This model has been used a lot during the COVID-19 pandemic, as researchers have tried to quickly understand the virus and the effectiveness of various treatments and vaccines. Here's a preprint publication on the effectiveness of the Pfizer vaccine. You can see the warning that it has not been peer-reviewed, but you can also see that it has had 201 comments that can be used by the authors to improve the paper before publication. The downside of preprint papers is that sometimes clinical decisions start being based on their findings before they are properly vetted. We saw this with ivermectin. The first paper looking at ivermectin's effectiveness for treating COVID-19 was published in a preprint paper using data from a company called Surgisphere. This paper was hugely influential and led to widespread use of ivermectin. Unfortunately, as scientists started reading and digging into the details, it was determined that the data were fabricated and that much of the paper was plagiarized. The company was investigated and determined to be a shell with only 11 staff running what was supposedly a massive global data analytics company. Most of the staff had no scientific background. In fact, the science editor was a science fiction writer and artist, while the director of sales and marketing was a model and brand ambassador. That paper was ultimately retracted due to an expression of concern and is now under formal investigation. We were left with millions of people around the world who still believe ivermectin is effective. Withdrawing that paper actually just fed into conspiracies that the effectiveness of this drug is being covered up by big pharma. The last advance in scientific publishing that I'll talk about is the wide proliferation of online journals. This has been great from the perspective of the vast amount of knowledge now available and the fact researchers have more places to publish their work. But this has also had a downside, which is the rise of the so-called predatory publishers. Predatory journals and publishers have been defined as those that prioritize self-interest at the expense of scholarship, are characterized by false or misleading information, deviate from best editorial and publication practices, including no retractions, lack transparency, or the use of aggressive and indiscriminate solicitation practices. Although we have a definition, in practice it's been difficult to identify the problem journals. There have been attempts at creating lists of predatory publishers, like the Beals list. problem with these lists is the possibility of misclassifying a legitimate journal as predatory or vice versa. Two other classification methods have been the Cabell's list of predatory and verified journals, as well as the directory of open access journals. You can see that some journals that have been deemed legitimate by the directory of open access journals were deemed predatory by Beal and Cabell. I do want to highlight the directory of open access journals. This is a screen capture of their website. This site is a great resource for finding papers, and it can be found with a quick Google search. A search of the term physiotherapy identifies 6 fully open access journals, including the Archives of Physiotherapy, which has the Directory of Open Access Journals seal of approval. I also want to say a little about Jeffrey Beal. Beal was the librarian working at the University of Colorado, Denver, when he coined the term predatory journal. In 2008, he started receiving numerous requests from dubious journals to serve on their editorial boards. He said that he immediately became fascinated because most of the emails contained numerous grammatical errors. He started keeping a list and published this online, labeling at one time up to 1/5 of all journals as predatory. As you can expect, these journals were not happy and started to push back. There was a bit of a smear campaign with many websites and blogs slandering Beal, threatening him with lawsuits, and accusing him of being a host of things, including an academic terrorist, an alcoholic, or a marijuana user. They must have mined his Facebook profile to get some of these photos. In the end, Beal gave up, stopped publishing his list, and retired from academia. In Beal's case, it seemed that fake news prevailed. But the question remains as to whether Beal was doing legitimate academic work. How can we judge the quality and impact of an individual researcher? One method is by looking them up in Google Scholar, which profiles the work of individual researchers. We can see that Beal has been verified by his email at his university. It also shows that he's published in many scientific journals, including Nature, and these papers have been cited by other researchers. Lastly, it provides something called the H-index. We can see that Beal's H-index is 26, which is very respectable. So what exactly is an H-index? Well, it's an author-level measure of productivity indicating the impact a particular author's publications are having. It's calculated as the number of papers that have been cited in other papers that number of times. So Beal had 26 papers that were cited at least 26 times in other papers. H-index is a useful indicator of researcher impact. We can see that someone who is well known within the physiotherapy community, like Paul Hodges, has a very high H-index. His is 114. That means he has 114 papers that have been cited at least 114 times. Lastly, I want to talk briefly about journal impact factor. This is a journal-level measure that provides an indication of the relative importance of a journal in its field. It's still widely used in science, and annual journal impact factor rankings are published. You can see the physiotherapy journals with highest impact factor are the Journal of Physiotherapy at 7.0 and JOSPT at 4.75. That was 2020 ranking. One major problem with impact factor, though, is that it's the average number of citations to recent articles, which means that it's very sensitive to outliers. So one highly cited article can raise a journal's impact factor, even if that article is being cited because of controversy or flawed methods. So there's a move in science away from journal impact factors and towards other strategies for assessing journals, as well as the impact of scientific work. Anyone interested in this can look up the Declaration on Research Assessment, DORA. That's everything I wanted to say about advances in the publishing industry and the benefits and challenges presented by open access publishing. Next up, I've invited 3 speakers who are much more adept at using the internet and social media for finding evidence. We've asked them to share their experiences and any advice that they have related to spotting low quality and questionable evidence.
Thanks very much, Doug, for that overview of open access and predatory publication. That's certainly a very important issue for all users of research to be wary of and aware of as they are finding and using evidence, especially when finding and using evidence available online. And that leads perfectly into the next part, Chapter 3 of our presentation this morning, which is about spotting low quality or questionable evidence, and particularly marketing, media, social media, memes, and fact checking. And for this chapter, we actually are drawing on the knowledge and experience of 3 clinicians who are in the early phases of their career. They're either just finishing their studies or just starting their career as physiotherapists. So we have Alex Sue, Andrea Young, and Alex Bell-Moratto speaking to us about social media and searching for evidence on social media. It's my pleasure to turn it over to you, Alex, to lead us off on this topic.
Hi everybody, my name is Alex Sue. I'm a physiotherapist intern in the Edmonton area, and thank you for joining us on this presentation on social media and evidence-informed practice. Here are my disclaimer and disclosures, and let's get into it. Okay, so how did we even get here? Why are we talking about social media? Well, in my opinion, social media can help address some barriers to evidence-informed practice. And as this meme shows on the right, oftentimes that can be a challenge in day-to-day practice. So in my impression, social media can really help us address 4 key areas of barriers to evidence-informed practice. The first being the research to practice gap. The second being the sheer quantity of evidence that we have to consume as clinicians. Article accessibility or evidence accessibility, and then lastly, our engagement, our interactions with research. Okay, so how does social media even help us address these barriers? The first being the research to practice gap. Well, in my opinion, and as shown in this meme, I think it helps us acknowledge that the gap exists. It keeps us humble and gives us a little bit of humility about the fact that sometimes our practice is not as up-to-date as we hope it is. On top of that, I think a really, really key point is that social media is a great tool to help bring attention to new and really newsworthy research that can be important for discussing how we change our practice or how we might change policy. All things that are constantly evolving, keeping us in the conversation. And now when it comes to just the sheer quantity of evidence that we have to digest as clinicians, I think social media does an excellent job at, especially reputable sources like BJSM, at promoting more synthesized sources, systematic reviews, meta-analyses, things that are more filtered and higher levels of evidence that might be really, really quick and efficient for us to use as clinicians. On top of that, social media is a great way of presenting things in really digestible ways. So infographics, especially even quick reads that are adapted for social media, are great ways for us to keep in touch with evidence, keep informed, or at least spark intrigue in things that we might want to read. And then on top of that, kind of linking to the second point, it helps us refine our own readings and searches through observing what other people are interacting with, are reading, are liking, are commenting on. Okay, when it comes down to the accessibility of evidence, and specifically kind of article accessibility and paywalls, social media is a great way of promoting open access articles, as well as linking it with direct access PDFs. So here we have a tweet by Peter O'Sullivan, who's a clinician and researcher, who has linked a direct access PDF that you can access right from the tweet. If you open it, it will go straight to a PDF. So a great way of making it more accessible to clinicians and researchers. On top of that, as we know, everyone hates paying for articles. I know nobody that does it. Social media finds a way and the community finds a way, and oftentimes you might even get people promoting things that are a little bit more fringe to get around paywalls. So here we have a tweet by Adam Meekins promoting Sci-Hub. Okay, lastly, and probably the most obvious one, is that social media can help us with the engagement we have with research. So back to the tweets, we have a little healthy debate or communication here in a tweet thread from Peter O'Sullivan again that really shows that social media can help normalize debate, bring us right back to that kind of group discussion, classroom setting that I crave so much as a new grad, that allows us to see different perspectives and really see how everyone differently appraises research or practice. It also allows clinicians and researchers to interact in near real time, something that isn't really possible outside of conferences in ways outside of social media. And lastly, my favorite one is that social media can use humor and imagery to really evoke interest in evidence. So here we have a tweet that is about Ben Smith et al., which I believe is some type of systematic review or guideline that kind of contrasts some different populations or ways of thinking in practice. So with those 4 barriers to evidence-informed practice I've presented, I've just kind of laid out some tips, my own personal tips for social media use. Obviously, social media is a risk and reward situation, a double-edged sword, whatever you want to call it. And so sometimes you're going to have these downsides. So things like confirmation bias, overgeneralizations, inefficiency with how you're using social media. And obviously, with any type of interaction, you can get very polarizing views. And then additionally, with social media, you can have very outdated posts or outdated, misguided information and fake accounts even. So that's something obviously we all have to interact and deal with, but kind of my tips and solutions for that is to define your own personal boundaries, determine what works for you, make sure to take breaks, be mindful of your work and life balance, and then of course, just follow diverse perspectives. That's the beauty of using social media, is to see all these wonderful ways that you can actually think and see these great clinicians around you. Then lastly, one of the things I thought would be useful to present is just some social media resources that are commonly used. So obviously posts, tweets, memes, infographics, comment sections, podcasts are all great ways to get information from social media platforms. And what I have shown here is the kind of grouping that is taken from my own community and my own online presence and the people I interact with. The most commonly used ones within my own social community were Twitter, Instagram, Rehab Plus, and Physio Network. Physio Network being a subscription service that gives you very filtered and summarized research articles, and Rehab Plus being a great way to get rehab-related articles. Ultimately, all of this, you're still going to get articles, and the best way to see if it works is you still got to appraise it. One note here is the Raven, the Sci-Hub Raven. Most people I know do use Sci-Hub as a last-ditch resort to find articles, and obviously everyone will have their own way and own risk tolerance, but it's kind of a user beware kind of thing. Okay, and to wrap it up, I just want to present this meme that I really enjoyed about just the difficulty of actually appraising research and determining what's good and what's bad in social media. So I just want to thank you for listening and thank you for your time for my part of the presentation, and I'll let Andrea Young and Alex Bell-Moratto present on some great ways to determine what's good and what's bad out there. Thanks.
My name is Andrea Young, and I am a second-year physiotherapy student at the University of Alberta. For this section of the webinar, I'm going to be discussing from the student-clinician perspective some of the benefits and drawbacks of using social media to identify evidence. I'll also talk a bit about some of the things that I look for when deciding whether or not to trust a source. A few disclaimers. This is a big topic, and we only have a few minutes, so I won't be able to cover all of the possible considerations. Also, throughout the presentation, I share some posts that I found on Instagram. These are not accounts that I necessarily promote or endorse, but are simply used as examples. Finally, as I mentioned, I'm a student with limited clinical experience, so I expect my perspectives may change and grow as I continue to develop my practice. So, should we use social media to find evidence? I think sure, but with some caution. And I'll get to that in a minute, but first, let's talk about some of the benefits. And to do that, I'd like to pull up a few examples of the types of posts I often see. First, what I'll call the debate meme. This starts with a funny meme about a controversial topic, and discussion or sometimes arguments ensue. Next, journal club. Someone, or in this case, the journal itself, provides a synopsis of a new peer-reviewed paper. Finally, the anecdote. A clinician shares about their experience with a particular patient.
And across these examples, one of the major benefits I see is accessibility of information. All of this info is literally at our fingertips, which is helpful when living in a busy world where new research isn't always available to us without a fee. This 2019 review just shows how prevalent knowledge sharing over social media has become. And interestingly, another study published by Clark et al. In 2020 found that researchers themselves are using social media to share their work. The second benefit is opportunity for clinicians to discuss the research and share their clinical expertise. These discussions can help us be more critical and consider alternative perspectives. It also gives us students a peek at that real-world experience. Finally, as for the benefits of sharing anecdotes, we all know anecdotes are the lowest form of evidence, but I think they can still provide some value. For example, hearing about patients who don't fit the research population exactly, or whose condition doesn't follow the normal disease trajectory, or who are living with a condition that isn't well researched. But of course, there are drawbacks. We often don't personally know the people we're following and engaging with on social media. Even if they say they're a physiotherapist, are they really? And with the ability to share and access information so easily, misinformation is everywhere. Additionally, there are trolls, people deliberately trying to get a rise out of others, and these bots, automated programs responding as if they're real people. All of this can make interacting on social media and deciding what we can or cannot trust feel overwhelming. So what do we do? Well, I like to ask myself a few questions. Who is making the post? Do they provide their name and qualifications? If they do, I should be able to Google them. What kind of evidence are they sharing? If they're referencing research, did they include a citation? If it's from an anecdote, is that made clear? When is the evidence from? If there is a publication, is it recent? Why are they making this post? Is it educational, or are they trying to sell me something? And finally, how outlandish are their claims? If someone is making a very big claim, that might trigger some alarm bells for me that I need to dig a little deeper. And these are similar questions to tools that have been designed to help students and the general public more critically read online sources, such as the CARP test. Now, if a specific study is being described, I can also start to think about the critical appraisal tools that we've learned about in school. A social media post is not going to contain all the information I need to complete one of these tools, but it can still help guide our thinking. And if I choose to read the whole article, and if I can access it, then I can use one of these tools. I do know that many students feel like they won't have time to critically appraise articles once they're working, and I think that that's a very valid concern. But from my perspective, even if a practitioner is not completing the appraisal tool in detail, having a solid understanding of these components of high-quality research will still help them to be more critical of the literature. And another important thing to remember is that reading these posts critically and using a critical appraisal tool is a skill. So to use a favorite physio saying, use it or lose it. We need to practice this in order to be good at it. So in conclusion, social media is a useful tool for identifying new evidence. However, we shouldn't just take a post at its word. We need to think critically, ask ourselves questions, and use appraisal tools when possible. Also, we can share with our colleagues, get their opinions. I know this isn't necessarily a perfect system, but I think it's a good start. I am looking forward to hearing what Doug and the Alexes think. And if anyone is interested, these are the references that I used for the information in these slides.
Hello, everybody. My name is Alex Bell-Moratto. I'm a student physiotherapist at the University of Alberta. I've also previously written a master's thesis looking at people's beliefs about back pain. And today I'm going to be talking about how to find evidence-based information while you're scrolling online. Before we dive into it, I just want to preface that these are my own views and don't necessarily reflect the views of the University of Alberta, Physiotherapy Alberta, or any other bodies. And I use a couple examples. I don't receive any compensation for this. I just found them and thought they were good examples. Okay, let's dive right in. Now, how to find gold in a sea of every possible opinion, idea, or thought that's all being shot at you one tweet at a time. So I have two kind of big rules that I generally go by. First of all, I just try to find the original source of the information. I think that helps us start to be a little bit more critical about the information we're taking in. And also, it's a big red flag if you can't find the original source. And then the other thing I like to do is just follow at least a couple accounts that have valid, different perspectives than mine. It can be not the funnest activity at times, but I think it's important to help, personally, to help me grow as a clinician. And these are the type of places where you can see some really good discussion, and it can really change your perspective on things, as opposed to other areas of social media where it's more like a dumpster fire. So next I'll list just a couple red flags that kind of get my spidey senses tingling. If a post or a page really just gives off guru vibes, or there's just like, hubris, where it's like so confident that their method is going to work for absolutely everything out there, that's a big red flag for me. Because as we know, the research on rehab it's very gray. There's a lot of nuance. So this is kind of a warning sign that they're not delving into that. Or another one is heavily relying on anecdotes. Like testimonials are all over the place on social media, and I get it. It resonates with patients. But I do think that there's some people who it's clear that they're just looking at what they see in the clinic every day and not being critical about that, going into the research, checking their biases, things like that. And then lastly, it's just a couple common examples of logical fallacies. I don't have too much time to talk about these, but there's tons of philosophy resources out there where you can see common fallacies, and take a look and see if that resonates with what you've been reading online. So now on the flip side, I'm going to talk about some things that I really like to see in a post or a page. The first being just humility and caveats. So if a page, this ties into that idea of things being gray and nuanced, right? So if a page reflects that, it tells me that they're thinking critically about their info and they're checking their biases and doing those types of things. So another element is that the page is well referenced and evolving. So this is a page I like a lot because a lot of times they post because new research has come out, and there's times when they'll change their position on things. They'll evolve, right? And that really ties into this idea of there's gray and it's nuanced, but you can't be absolute. And another element is when it's clear that a post is as concerned with the quality as much as they are the marketing. Or if you think of it in reverse, there's times when it's pretty obvious that a page is much more concerned with how good it looks instead of being concerned with what really matters, the quality. So then once you find some of these resources, you can start to just look at who are these people engaging with online, who are they doing speaking engagements with, going on their podcasts, stuff like that. So hopefully a couple of these tips and tricks are helpful as you wade through the overload of info online. Feel free to contact me if you have questions, or if you think I've really missed the boat on anything. I love discussing this type of stuff, so feel free to contact me.
I'd like to thank all of our speakers for being part of this morning's first episode in our evidence-based practice webinar series. Unfortunately, Alex Sue, Andrea Young, and Alex Bell-Moratto are unable to join us for the question and answer portion of the presentation today. However, they have indicated that they're happy to take questions, so if you'd like to send them an email or get in touch with them via social media, they've provided their contact information. Doug Gross and Teri Slade have also indicated that they're happy to take questions in that format, but they're also here with us today to take your questions live. So at this point, we welcome questions from the audience.
Doug, I know you had mentioned you have a question for Teri to kick us off as we wait for audience questions. So again, just remind the audience to type your question into the question pod on the right-hand side of your screen. But over to you, Doug, with your question first.
Thanks, Leanne. Yeah, it was a really great presentation, Teri, and you made me wonder about one thing. With these different ways of knowing, I was wondering, is it possible for one person to hold different ways for different situations or questions? Sort of a pragmatic approach? Or, I mean, do you have to adhere to one school of thought?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think pragmatism is in itself a sort of way of knowing. So I would say that some people uphold the concept that you can align yourself with, say, positivism for one study and constructivism for another study, and yet critical theory for another study. I guess it depends on who you ask, and some people will use that approach to work in kind of mixed methods. So if you have some research where there's a qualitative component and a quantitative component, you will have some people who will use different ways of knowing for each component of the study, and that we call that pragmatism. Others would say that it's not, that there isn't the same integrity to that. So if you personally as a researcher see the world through a critical lens, then it is unlikely that you're not going to see those power structures as central to a phenomenon. Regardless of how you approach the research, you're going to see those power structures as a component of it. And as a clinician, when you're making decisions, if constructivism is something that you personally align with, then you're going to see it that way, no matter what that interaction looks like. So I think it depends on who you ask, and I think I don't judge people either way. If you want to go pragmatist with the way that you make clinical decisions, then that's great. But if you align yourself with one of those four, positivism, post-positivism, constructivism, critical theory, it's okay to stick to your guns, so to speak, with the way that you know about evidence and clinical decision making. Either is acceptable in my mind.
So building on that, Teri, I'm just curious, do you think it's important that researchers, it's kind of common in qualitative research, I would suggest, or at least that's my observation, but is it important for all researchers to identify, what their way of knowing is or what approach they're bringing to their research? And is it important for clinicians to identify that? Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's okay. Yeah, absolutely. I think researchers and clinicians need to consider how they know things, because if we never interrogate how we know the things that we know, then we're going to be taking assumptions, thinking that some people are right, some people are wrong, some sources of information are right, some sources of information are wrong, and if we don't interrogate that, then we may go around thinking that, say, only randomized controlled trials are appropriate for clinical decision making, and something that you read on Twitter about Indigenous patients' experiences with physiotherapy for low back pain, if that's something that you read on Twitter, that you might, if you align with, say, positivism and you see randomized controlled trials as the only valid evidence for making those decisions, then you're going to ignore what those things that you've read on Twitter. But if you kind of examine, say, oh yeah, I am, what am I doing here? I'm aligning with positivism, and I could consider, if they consider things through a critical light, do I accept the idea that maybe Indigenous voices aren't present in most randomized controlled trials? And you can consider that, and if you accept that or if you dismiss that, is a decision that you're making consciously, as opposed to pushing out ideas that maybe come through social media that could influence your clinical decision making. And likewise, you don't want to go the other direction and make those choices mindlessly. So considering as a clinician how you're making those decisions, I think that has a really positive potential in clinical practice for us to examine the things that maybe we've known our entire clinical working life. You may say that this is the way I've always done things, this is how I know what I know, but if you step back and consider that, that offers a new potential to become a better clinician for all of your clients.
Great to think about it. Yeah, that's a good point. I'm going to switch gears, and Doug, I have a question for you, because I know that you are published author. I know you're also a journal editor, if I'm not mistaken. Can you talk a little bit about time to publication and sort of the difference between traditional publication and what would be common from the timeline from journal submission or paper submission to journal publication as compared to what we see in open access publication or online publication, maybe it's a better way of putting it, and how that compares again to what you see with more predatory publication, if you will?
Well, that's a good question. That is another part of the publishing industry that's really dramatically changed in the last few years. Mm-hmm. I would say that on the whole, pretty much all of the journals are switching to some type of online publication. I mean, one journal that I've published in the past that had a really long delay. I mean, sometimes we would wait for 3 years from the point where the paper was accepted to when it comes out in print. Even that journal recently changed to having an online option where it's published within a couple of weeks after being accepted. But I mean, in general, the open access journals are very quick. That's another benefit, right? It's accepted, it's formatted, and it's put online as a PDF that anyone can download, usually within a matter of days. But I think that the traditional journals are catching up, and things are really improving.
So can you talk about the timeline from when you would submit a paper to a more established journal? I will use that term. How long does it take to get it accepted?
Well, sometimes it can take a long time, depending on how many rounds of revisions and how much work the paper needs. Sometimes it's really quick. Like my record for having a decision back from a journal, I submitted a paper one time to the British Medical Journal, and they had rejected it and got the decision back to me within 3 hours. So I submitted it in the morning, and I had the decision in the afternoon. So those kind of decisions can be really quick. But there's a ton of variability. I think it depends a lot on the nature of the research that you're doing. Are there people available that can review that? I mean, as an editor, finding reviewers for papers is really challenging and becoming harder and harder through the pandemic as people have less and less time and availability for doing this. So my approach is if I don't have reviewers identified within 2 months, I think 2 months is a reasonable time frame, I'll go back to the authors and I'll say, look, we're having a really hard time. Might not be the journal for you. You're welcome to go somewhere else, or suggest some reviewers. So anyway, I've seen decisions made from hours to, I think the worst paper I had took 2 years from the date that we submitted to when it was accepted, just with 5 different rounds of revisions and fixing.
Right. And of course, the thing that you said in there that stuck out to me was it's 3 hours for a reject, but it sounds like it's a lot longer for an accept. Is that a fair statement?
I would say it's usually longer. Yeah, I mean, on average, you're looking at a period of 2 to 3 months. Okay, and so another question I have for you about, sort of trying to sort through the difference between an online publication that's just, it happens to be open access versus a predatory publication. I'm just wondering, are there any indicators that you use when you look at, an open access publication or something you can find online easily and without, going behind paywall? Are there any indicators you use to help you to spot, questionable evidence or things that maybe make you think twice and question what you're seeing? So from a journal perspective, I was actually just doing this morning. I was thinking that it would be great to have a journal of rehabilitation science methods. And so I did a Google search. I was like, are there journals out there? And there were 4 or 5 that came up. And it was pretty clear that 3 of them were fairly new. So I look at the date. I look at the quality of the website. So a couple of them, there was a lot of spelling errors and grammatical problems. And these kind of things are looking, it's kind of making me judge that it's more on the predatory side of things. And sure enough, they were pay-to-publish type journals that were not indexed. So the other huge thing that I look for is whether the journal is indexed in reputable databases, things like Scopus or Medline, right? A lot of the newer online journals, especially the predatory journals, will not be indexed. So that's kind of a stamp of approval. So in these large databases like Medline, they kind of accept legitimate journals, and they will highlight, like when you do a search in Medline, the findings show up from the legitimate journals. That's a really important one. Is it indexed? And then lastly, and this is less and less, but I talked about it in my presentation there, but it's the impact factor of the journal. That's still important in science. You know, what is the impact factor? Does it have an impact factor? It's another indication of how reputable a journal is. When it comes to the individual paper, though, I think so there's questions around judging a journal, and then there's questions around judging the papers. And it's becoming harder and harder. Like some of these online and even predatory journals have really fantastic formatting, and the papers look really, really professional and slick. So it truly is, like Andrea said, a matter of reading and appraising, and actually looking at the quality of the scientific offering.
Okay, I have one more question. I know we're just about at the end of our time, but I have one more question for you, and it has to do with social media. And unfortunately, neither of the Alexes and nor Andrea were able to join us for the Q&A. But from your perspective, we've seen over the last 18 months that social media is a great way for really poor quality evidence to be promoted. We've seen that a lot with COVID-19, for example. So I'm just wondering if you have any advice for folks as they start to read things on social media, read evidence on social media, and in terms of how far or how to drill down into who's tweeting an article to try to determine if there's first off, if the evidence that they're sharing is credible, but also if there's some sort of a conflict at play that might be playing into the social media activity of the individual.
It's a great question, and it's really challenging to do. I think that both Alex and Andrea addressed this a little bit, and I liked what Alex had to say about finding the original source. Right? And sometimes you have to follow through a thread or multiple retweets or what have you, but try to get the original source paper or individual where it's coming from. And, that might be enough. You might be able to find the PDF and quickly read the abstract in the article, make a judgment there. But I do think it's important to follow the money, and that's a little bit harder to do, especially on Instagram and some of these other sites where it's hard to know exactly what they're being sponsored for. Not often do they disclose or talk about the funding that they're receiving, but I do make an attempt to do that. It's really hard to do, and in fact, I got together with Andrea and the Alexes, and we had a conversation, and we recorded it in Zoom. So we'll send out the link. That turned into like a 45-minute conversation, and these are the issues that we talked about during this debate. So maybe there's some more answers there.
Fair enough. Teri, do you have anything to weigh in with that?
Yeah, I agree with the things that Doug is saying, and yeah, of course, with what Alex and Andrea were saying about finding the source. Oftentimes you'll see things, and maybe if you're on Twitter, you've done this sort of thing yourself, where you retweet something, and mostly what you've read is the headline of whatever the link is, and something that other people have tweeted about it, or haven't. Oftentimes things can be retweeted without the person retweeting it having read the entire source material. So, if it's Twitter that we're talking about, I'm not on Instagram, so my experience with that is less. So definitely, listen to the conversation that Doug referenced there. But I think, reading that source material is really important, and I think it's also very important to kind of keep a level head about things, because with social media, oftentimes you'll find that people get very upset about things, and they're expressing that upset in social media, and you know, it's wonderful to be able to hear what people have to say, but it's also easy to get caught up in how upset people are about something without necessarily looking into the issue yourself. So I would encourage anyone who's using social media as a way to find evidence or to influence their practice, that you kind of keep a level head and listen broadly and go into those source materials, because there's often a lot more to the story than what you can fit in a tweet or an Instagram post.
Fair enough. Good points. So what I'm taking away from this conversation today is there really is no shortcut for doing that critical appraisal, that there's some things to look for around publication time, perhaps, but also spell checks and journal indexing to look at when you see resources available easily. And yeah, back to that critical appraisal and critical appraisal. So I think that's the topic for future conversation, if I'm not mistaken, Doug. And I look forward to that with great interest. And with that, I think we'll draw the webinar to a close. Thank you to all of our presenters, and thank you to everyone who was here with us today to join in this conversation. We'll look forward to seeing you